Hello, I'm Nicole Poulin. I'm Executive Director for the Family and Children's Trust Fund, or FACT of Virginia. And welcome to our latest Lunch and Learn session, which is part of FACT's 35th anniversary celebration week. Today, we're going to be talking about ageism and how it shapes our framework. Before we get started, I'd like to remind folks a little bit about FACT. We're a public-private partnership that was established by the General Assembly in 1986 to support services and awareness for family violence across the lifespan. That includes child abuse and neglect, domestic and sexual violence, and abuse against older adults. FACT is also tasked with advising the governor and state agencies on issues related to family violence. To learn more about FACT and our work, please go to our website, fact.virginia.gov. Now let's turn to the topic at hand. We're so pleased and honored to have gerontologist Gigi Amato here with us today to discuss an issue that doesn't get a lot of attention in our society, ageism. Gigi's career in health and human services spans over 30 years with experience in AIDS, HIV services, homeless services, aging and disability services, and philanthropy. Currently, she's the Director of Research and Evaluation for the Longevity Project for Greater Richmond. She's also adjunct faculty for the Department of Gerontology at VCU, or Virginia Commonwealth University. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Urban Planning, Master's of Science in Gerontology, and a PhD in Health-Related Science, all from VCU. Her research interests include person-centered trauma-informed care, social connection, narrative practices, resilience across the lifespan, and direct care workforce. She's also a certified yoga instructor and the author of 7 books for children and teens, and she lives in the city of Richmond with her family. And Gigi, I have to tell you that everybody I told about this was so excited. You are very well known in the area and just adored and respected. So we are just so lucky to have you today to talk about this. So thanks and welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm so happy to be with y'all. Happy anniversary.
Thanks. Yeah. I just want to take a quick minute to call out Taylor Holy, who's our Senior Research Associate, and Jenny Powell, who is one of our FACT board members. Both super smart and wonderful people, and we are lucky to have them to be part of this too. So we'll just get started. Our format for this was just going to be more of a conversation type of discussion. We know that, FACT has a very broad scope as far as looking at these issues. I will say, like so many other areas in our culture, we have not put a whole lot of focus on the issue of ageism and the older adult population, which is something I would love for us to we have an opportunity to do a lot more in that field. And just full disclosure, me personally, professionally, I don't have a lot of experience or expertise on this topic. I've spent most of my time really working with children, child abuse and neglect, and domestic and sexual violence, and not specifically issues related to the older population. So I have a lot of information to learn too. So we are really excited to have you here for a lot of reasons. So no pressure, Gigi.
No pressure, right? Yeah.
So why don't we start? Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to this work?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. But let me just also say, because I think I sped past it, truly happy 35th anniversary. I think, this is just a moment to say sometimes we really get things right in Virginia, and the Family and Children's Trust Fund is one of those things that we get right in Virginia. And I know my work has so benefited from FACT for many years, and it's pretty extraordinary when you think of the body of work that has been built over these 3.5 decades. And I think the culmination of that and having these strong ticking networks that you all have really invested in and worked with across the state is amazing. And I think that's the type of system level advocacy and work that really does position Virginia, to be a space that is both safe and brave and embracing and welcoming of everyone, and also recognizing the truly corrosive impact of family violence across the lifespan and the toll that that takes, not only on individuals, but and families and neighborhoods and communities and everything. So I'm so grateful for FACT and for all of you. Yeah. What was the question?
Thank you very much. We really appreciate that. That means so much coming from you, particularly. All right, so just to circle us back around, can you tell us a little bit
Yes.
about your background and how you came to this topic and this issue, and how'd you get here?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. So as you said in my bio, most of my career since I finished college in the 80s really has been in health and human services, and it sort of early on started to develop a thread really focused around aging and disability services, and that's where I've spent the bulk of my career. When working in philanthropy in Richmond, that's really sort of where I marked this specific turn toward trauma and trauma-informed practices relative to older adults. And you can't move into that without really quickly understanding the impact and role of ageism. So in working several years ago in philanthropy at United Way in Richmond here, we were undergoing a pretty significant overhaul to our funding process. But for the first time in over a century, that organization opened up its process to be competitive for competitive grants, which was really also an opportunity to understand and hear what was happening in the community. After this overhaul of a new process, we did some analysis of what we had funded and how it aligned compared to our priorities. And what we saw was, even though we had not specifically requested any proposals around violence, family violence, violence intervention, or violence prevention, there was a strong thread across all funding areas that, in addition to looking at outcomes related to financial prosperity, related to education, related to health, about 25% of our whole portfolio was directly invested in outcomes related to violence education, violence prevention, or violence treatment. And we hadn't asked about it. We always had seen this poverty thread in our funding, but this was a pretty strong theme, and it had kind of gone, over our organizational head, so to speak. So our team spent about 18 months really engaging with families, with government, with civic groups, with our funding partners, to kind of ask what's happening here. We see this threat of violence. Are we right? And it was really the community of providers who reframed that for us to say, well, we think about it as trauma. And what do you know about trauma-informed care? And from a philanthropic perspective, that was new for us as a funder. So our community really helped us to reframe what you think you see as violence may indeed be violence, but there's a bigger, broader umbrella and way to think of it. And it was really an exciting time for us to start to learn about that. And we ran into another wall. When we started to talk with our aging service providers, we weren't hearing the same types of progress relative to thinking of trauma as almost a prevention framework, or a way to really re-examine our cultures, how we're providing services and how we're serving people. In fact, some of what we heard when we were talking to aging services were things like, what are you going to do? She was an 80-year-old woman with dementia. You're not going to try cognitive behavioral therapy. So that may well be true in terms of a specific intervention, but yet the messaging we were hearing kind of smacked of internalized ageism within our work, that maybe we really weren't connecting all of the dots and understanding really the impact of trauma across the lifespan. Which, if I can just kind of keep going down this rabbit hole, I think that any number of our providers and kind of subsectors of health and human services have done an extraordinary job of sort of flipping the adverse childhood experiences framework into an early childhood prevention framework. That's extraordinary how that single study has sparked an entire movement. What we also know from the original ACE study is that the damage of early childhood trauma continues across the lifespan, right? That study was initially about adults. our network in terms of aging services hadn't really been able to operationalize that. So we were doing a lot of work around social isolation and loneliness, but not quite able to connect these dots. And so that became more and more just the space I was interested in. And so in 2018, I went back to graduate school to study gerontology with a specific interest in trying to better understand how does trauma-informed work and how do these bigger concepts of trauma and resilience, how can they lift up our work with elders? And what really does this body of work speak to the Aging Service Network? So I went back to graduate school and got my master's degree and finished that in 2018. So I guess I went back to 2017 and then continued on with the work and complete my PhD in 2021. Really because I wanted some answers, and I felt like our work in aging and disability services was largely being left out of this super important conversation, because I think the trauma-informed framework, it can be transformational to how we deliver services. It's not always, but I think it can be.
And it's all about resilience, right? It's all about how do we, prevent. We are all about prevention and recognizing the fact that from a societal perspective, on most issues, we don't do a very good job of really preventing a lot of things. But then also with regard to resilience, like how do we then mitigate some of the harm that is created by exposure to ACEs and really all forms of trauma that we're kind of swim in daily. So yeah, I think that's a wonderful kind of background and context for a lot of the work that we do, and also for our discussion today. So to get kind of in the weeds a little bit, can you tell us what is gerontology and how has it changed, like say over the last 20 years, 30 years?
So, I think of gerontology as the science of aging. We might layer in there, in addition to the science of aging and the study of aging, the study of the experience of being old and growing old. And I emphasize the verb growing old. It's different from geriatrics. Often the term gerontology and geriatrics are used similarly and synonymously. They're different. So geriatrics is a specific branch of medicine that really is focused on disease, disorder, and treatment of disease, disorder in older people. Gerontology, on the other hand, takes a lifespan approach and looks at what is this process of development like across our whole lives, and really draws from this holistic perspective of and belief that all stages of our life are made up of periods of decline, all stages and ages, of maintaining, and of growing. That it takes an entire lifetime to grow into the people that we are to become. It's a different filter than approaching a person as what symptoms are you showing here? What are the things that are bothering your body, and how do we adjust and fix those? So gerontology really tries to understand what it's like to grow old, and also kind of pretty heavily anchored in this idea that we're all different, right? Embracing of the heterogeneity of aging. That as we grow older, we become more ourselves and more different from how we were and from everyone else. And so it's a very nice way of, it fits with approaches to care like person-centered care and like trauma-informed care, because it's really underpinned with this idea that to serve a person well, we have to know a person. And it means not only knowing their body and their biology, but their whole kind of biopsychosocial spiritual self in a nutshell. How has it changed in the last few years? I think it's rapidly changing, and some of those changes are paralleling some of these broader and bigger societal changes that we see. I think right now in gerontology, there is a very strong emphasis on health equity and disparity. And how that plays out in aging is, I don't know, have you ever heard of the phrase longevity equity? So Nicole has. So longevity equity is this idea that how fabulous would it be for everyone to have the same opportunity to grow old and to grow old well? And for any number of environmental or other factors, we don't all have that same opportunity. And you get a really great example of that. I don't know if I can figure out the chat fast enough, but many of y'all probably have used and are familiar with some of the work that's come out of the VCU Center on Society and Health, where I think maybe 2015 or 2016, they did a number of studies looking at aging and life expectancy in cities around the country. One of them was Richmond. So what they found here in Richmond was a big disparity in life expectancy based on the neighborhood that you were raised in. So in VCU's study, yeah, blue zones. So that was great. Who said that? Audrey. Oh, let's talk about blue zones. That's a great connection to longevity. But these VCU Society and Health studies found in Richmond that, if a person was born and raised in Gilpin Court, their life expectancy was 63, as opposed to 7 miles away. If you're born and raised in Westover Hills, life expectancy was 83. So that's a 20-year difference. So I think that's a turn longevity is taking. Gerontology this is a real phenomenon here, that not all of us have the opportunity, the resources, and access to the pieces we need in our lives to grow old, and to grow old in a healthy and well way. I think that's a turn. One of the turns I'm most interested in gerontology is a growing and greater emphasis on story and on narrative. And this idea that care is actually conducted through narrative, through the exchange of stories between a provider or caregiver or family member and someone else. The story itself and the exchange of story and the act of taking a stand and listening to someone's story, that itself is essential to care. So those are just a couple of the turns and twists that gerontology is taking lately.
So I wonder if this would fall in that realm. It does seem like that realm of gerontology and not geriatrics, but I was recently watching a documentary on dementia, and the neuroscience around kind of the aging brain has changed so much just in the last 5 years. It was amazing to me, because they had case studies of folks with early onset, what they think is Alzheimer's or dementia, and the changes just in their lifestyle and diet, the significance of really reversing many of those symptoms was astounding to me. And I thought that, that's really new science. And so would that fall, Gigi, more kind of in the line of geriatrics, because it's like dementia is kind of a sickness or an illness, I guess, or gerontology, or is there like an interconnection there?
Yeah, I think both. I think it falls in both, and so often it also depends on sort of how we approach the evidence and how we apply it and implement it. But it's pretty exciting, and that comment that you just made ties back to what Audrey put into the chat around blue zones, right? And many of us are probably familiar with blue zones. I think there's some problems with blue zones, but we won't get into all those today. But the essence of blue zones, right, is that environmental and lifestyle factors and social factors can support and assist us in not only reaching longevity or exceeding life expectancy, but doing so in a way that we maintain a quality of life in our health, right? So I agree. I think that's some very exciting work from a prevention or kind of holistic perspective. Yeah. Well, even though we haven't figured out like a reliable sort of treatment or intervention for a number of the dementias, including Alzheimer's, we really understand the risk factors, and this whole lifestyle approach can really mitigate the risk. And as you're saying, also help us have gains later in life.
Yeah, it was really amazing. I mean, because some of these neurologists were talking about how, like, instead of, 5 or even 5 years ago, their first response to these types of symptoms would be to, like, go to the pharmaceutical route. And the kind of the historically the view was like, oh well, this is kind of, we're marching towards the end, and there's not much we can do. Get your affairs in order. And there's just been this radical shift
Yeah.
in medicine around, honestly, moving from this is obviously one documentary, so but it seemed, I mean, they had some pretty I think, well-respected experts in the field of neurology, that really shifting more to, like, in lieu of medication, really focusing on, like, specific diets, and one specific diet, mostly like Mediterranean diet, and then fasting, and in between eating, and then also, like, exercise routines and mindfulness
Yep.
practices were a huge part of this. And they were doing, like, evaluations 18 months before and after, and people's were
Yeah.
like,
Changed.
it was just amazing to me. But one of the comments that was made, and this really does relate, I think, to the issue of gerontology, was that, like, why wait, right? Why wait until you get diagnosed with early onset dementia to make these changes in your life? Because they can be really impactful anywhere in your life, at any point in your life.
Truly. And I think one of the other factors that is evident, I don't know if they talked about it in the documentary. I would be interested in knowing about that documentary, but also knowing whether they touched on social connection. So I think
It did.
there's such
Yes,
a
it did.
huge,
Huge.
huge piece, not only for us as we become elders, but really across the lifespan. I mean, that's a big part of your work with family violence prevention as well. We know, right? Like, without connection that is positive and strong and nurturing, infants don't survive. I mean, it's a survival issue, and that holds true across the lifespan. We have just so much great science around it now, and so many people have been devoting their careers to this. That there is now, according to the National Academy of Science and Engineering and Medicine, enough evidence to demonstrate a causal pathway between social isolation and premature death. So we know that connection is fundamental, and it is not a conflict connection or a negative, harmful connection, but a positive connection. And this is where I see a real opportunity for research, and I'm so appreciative for facts, openness around really thinking in a lifespan approach, because from my perspective, with an interest both in social connection and in trauma and resilience among elders, to me, so, and I'm a new researcher, but it looks like there's two separate bodies of evidence out there that really haven't come into to bridge quite yet. And so here's how I would frame it up, related to social connection. So a lot of the work and research and science around social connection in older adults really does tend to be storied. Let's keep talking about storied around the concept of not having many people in your life, being alone, being lonely, not having relationships. And so that's valid. And it's important for us to have relationships, and that these relationships work, and that they be positive and uplifting for us. So that's where a lot of this research around loneliness and isolation situates itself, of trying to examine existing roles and relationships and making sure people have those structures in place. If you take a little shift over and look at the research relative to intimate partner violence or elder abuse and other specific areas of trauma, there are many studies that demonstrate, one, that isolation and loneliness can be weaponized on purpose, right? I mean, we know that from the power and control wheel, that isolation, social exclusion, these are weapons that people use to perpetuate, abuse. So, but that connection hasn't necessarily been made in the broader social connection loneliness around the idea of positive relationships versus conflict relationships or harmful and abusive relationships. So I think there's a whole world of bridging these two areas. This feels really important to me. Mm-hmm.
That seems absolutely true. When we talk just with regard to children and ACEs, you know, and protective factors, it's all about relationships. And, you know, that's the key resiliency, you know, that's the magic sauce in most resiliency work is for children. It's a trusted, stable adult that can save a child from, you know, unspeakable trauma sometimes. And without that, really, you know, that child is kind of left in the sea of just trauma. But that seems true across the lifespan.
It is
the lifespan, that never stops, that having that, even if it's not an enormous social circle, but having a few key critical,
yes,
you know, touch points, that is, it just seems to be kind of hardwired into our hearts and souls as human beings to have
absolutely.
that, right?
Absolutely. And you know, one of the longest longitudinal studies, you might have heard of it. Sometimes it's called the Grant study, sometimes it's called the Harvard study. So Robert Waldinger is currently the director of the Harvard study. He's the fourth director. I think the Harvard study started in 1928. There's a lot of bias built into this study because in 1928 it started with like, I don't know, 700 or 800 sophomores at Harvard who were all white men. The study then expanded to include boys and young men from impoverished neighborhoods in Boston. So they did make some effort early on. But anyway, this study's been conducted since 1928, and it's pretty extensive. Now, today, not only do they do interviews and surveys and blood panels and brain scans and videos and looking at analyzing medical records, but here's the thing, Robert Waldinger, and if you want, his TED Talk says it beautifully, but he boiled it down to, look, if there's one thing we've learned from this study, good relationships keep us healthy and happy, period. That's it. And so here's where I think older adult services really has something to learn from early childhood. So if we know this, that relationships are our most protective and resilient space, 0 to 130, then shifting our resources into preserving and improving relationships makes sense. In early childhood, so I'll just pick on home visiting. The home visiting model does that within the context of an existing family, right? Moving in to be in a family space, to support that family where they are, and to, support the growth of positive relationships between parent and child. That and I think home visiting gets amazing results, and it's something that just should be lifted up, and like everybody should be able to have the opportunity. Now, in aging services, we do it a little bit differently. Two of the main interventions, and I don't want this to come off as like picking on people who are providing this service. However, our approach to supporting people who may be lonely or isolated in aging services is to introduce strangers into their life. That's not necessarily, and the evidence is inclusive about how helpful that is in actually changing someone's feelings about being lonely or about being isolated, right? So if the whole of our toolbox is to say, oh, you're lonely, okay, we'll have a stranger call you every day. There may be some good that comes out of that. We know you're safe, or, maybe with a nice chat, that's fine. And relationships take time to be built, and similar with friendly visiting. If our answer is only to bring strangers, that's not the same thing, right? Because our relationships are things that exist and we carry sort of with us. So anyway, I think we have a lot to learn from early childhood, and this emphasis that y'all, I know, that people have understood for quite some time.
So Jenny Pell has a great question, and I'm gonna jump in front of her because I want to touch on, because what you said I thought was such a great jumping off points for our next question, and really take a deeper dive into the topic of ageism. So ageism to most people, I think, would mean just kind of the really superficial definition of kind of discriminating or stereotyping against people based on their age. But what does that really mean? Like, what kind of significant impact does that have in our daily lives and how we talk to people, the services we provide to people, just how we view people as they age? Because I think you actually touched on a lot of that. Like, why is it that we see people that are older as not needing real connection or real support? And that idea that, oh, well, they're old, it's almost, it really is, not to be crass, but it is crass. It's like, well, they're going to die soon, so we don't want to really invest a lot in them. And that to me is just profoundly unethical and inhumane. And I think that if people maybe started seeing it more in kind of that crass way, that maybe that would help people be a little more sensitive to this topic. So can you kind of give us a broader view of what is ageism and how does it impact all of our work?
Yeah, I will do my best. It's a big topic, and there are people who are way more experts and versed in the complexity of ageism than I am. And so let me just also just take a minute while we're talking about ageism to sort of shout out the fact issue brief on elder abuse, because there's a really nice discussion of ageism in that paper. Y'all did a really great job. So one of the really beautiful things about where we are in the US in our civics right now is we do have this opportunity. I think our national conversations really around diversity, inclusion, belonging really give us an opportunity to move into a different space with thinking about what it means to be human, what it means to interact with other humans, and to kind of really celebrate the idea that we are all different, and in those differences we can connect and find similarities. So I think ageism is a piece of that work. It's not the piece maybe that we talk about quite a lot, but I think ageism is something that is worth adding into our diversity inclusion conversations. In a nutshell, as you say in the fact brief, ageism is the devaluing of someone based on their age. And I think we surely see it play out in social media and in the bigger media in any number of ways. If I think about the messaging around millennials, for example, or millennials in the workplace, that's straight up ageism, right? Like the story we're starting to hear about the demographic of millennials in the workplace is contrary to every experience I've had with millennials in the workplace. And so I think ageism, I best understand it as whenever we reduce a person to a single story about any single factor of their life, we are dehumanizing them. And we also, in a sense, are dehumanizing ourselves, or at least robbing ourselves, of the opportunity to, engage with a really deep, complex organism, to put it that way. I think, thanks, Audrey. I think COVID really has exposed how deeply ageist our society is in a couple of ways. We early on saw the public discourse very quiet and crickets around COVID, primarily, I believe, because the initial early outbreaks of COVID were in nursing homes. And folks didn't feel that to be of a priority. And then as the discourse expanded, you had things happening like elected officials saying things like, the grandparents in Texas are willing to take the hit on this. We've got to get the economy back, and all the grandparents in Texas be happy to give their lives over. Wait a minute, right? And then that continued into sort of a vilification of the direct care workforce. And many, I would say about 30% of direct care providers working in any number of settings, certified nursing assistants, PCAs, home health aides, about 30% of the workforce are elders, are over the age of 60. And sort of that workforce was really burdened with a lot of the narrative of COVID spread. that workforce was largely prevented from supporting themselves by working multiple jobs, because the spread of the virus and the story of the virus was largely pinned on, well, our workers are part-time, they work in a number of places, they bring this disease in and out, and right, and why is that? Because you pay them $10 an hour and they can't support their families. So I think ageism is harmful in how we tell the story. It's harmful in our interactions. And similar to what we're talking about with loneliness, there have been many researchers who have identified through longitudinal studies and meta-analysis a real, tangible, measurable life cost of about 7 years to when we experience internalized ageism or aging anxiety, largely produced because of the messaging we hear, then it impacts our quality of life. That may be through access to healthcare, that may be through differential treatment. So that I could keep on going, but it's probably, but maybe I will. There's one more little thing I want to say, and that is, I think this is a particularly dangerous intersection of trauma and ageism, right? So we know from the original ACEs study that study was about adults and looking at the lifelong impact of early adversity in childhood on our health status as we grow older. And we also, I think, learned from that study in our work that often people we put coping mechanisms in place early on to help us survive, to help us make meaning, and to help us deal with what has happened to us. And what happens sometimes then is the damage of our early experiences is masked in our ability to cope. In old age, if we come into our work with elders with wrong beliefs, I'll just say it like that, with wrong beliefs, that it is normal to be depressed when you're old, that it is normal to socially withdraw when you're old. So if we come into this idea of aging only as negativity, only as decline, only as futile, we are actively harming someone. This is, in essence, a re-traumatization, because we're failing to offer someone the opportunity for growth and failing to believe that until our very last breath, we grow, we change.
That was great. That was a really great beginning of a deep dive, and we've talked, these have been really great and beneficial, and we may start doing them. I think we probably will start doing them on a regular basis. So we're going to invite you back, I think, to talk about more of these issues, because they're so vast and there are so many different kind of components to them that we could talk all day about. So so we've gotten a comment and a question, and I think what I'm going to do is we have some specific questions that I had laid out that you and I had touched base on that I want to get through, and then we'll circle back around to the questions and comments if that's okay. So I want to kind of shift us, maybe not shift us, but or maybe just broaden our discussion, because FACT is focused around the issue, which is broad, but of family violence. Can you talk about any specific differences or maybe nuances to the issue of family violence as it relates to elders?
I think so. We're sure. Where I also kind of always have pause and caution is that it's all so personal and individualized, and so I think that's part of the real strength of both person-centered and trauma-informed approaches, in that at the beginning point, both of those approaches ask us first and foremost to really anchor into our full understanding of the person. So saying all that, I think, one of the most obvious opportunities to think about the impact of trauma in families and in elders that we're caring about is taking sort of stepping back and thinking about the historical lens, right? Sort of the historical arc of a person's life that may be influencing and impacting them throughout their lives. So for example, when I was in graduate school, I worked as a personal care aide for 2 years, and I worked with one woman. So if I could just tell you this story, and the first day I went on the job as a personal care aide, I knew very little about the person I would be working for. I knew her name, I knew her age. She was 95. I knew that she lived alone and that she had just moved into a new apartment. That's really it. And so as I showed up for my first shift and I went to knock on the door, I had what I can only explain is just sort of a flash of insight, like intuition. And I kind of had a moment before I went in where I kind of realized, like, oh my gosh, I believe I'm about to walk into the home of a 95-year-old African American woman. And at the time, I was 53. And my demographic is as a white woman. And I feel that it was a grace-filled moment because making that connection cognitively just helped me not to knock on the door, but to sort of step back and say, okay, so if she was born in 1995, I mean, if she was 95 and was born in 1923 at the time, and today it's 2018, there's a lot that has happened in her life. And while I can't know what those things are, because I have an understanding of history and geography, and I know that she lives here in Richmond, it's not a leap to think that through her experiences of living through Jim Crow, of living through segregation and civil rights movement, it may not be a stretch to think that my embodiment could be triggering for her, particularly in a close, physical, and intimate situation where I'm coming in now to prepare her meals and assist her with bathing. And that was that proved to be the case, and it was really a helpful shift for me, thinking just about sort of the historical arc of her life, what that potentially might have meant without even knowing anything about her, and how my insertion into her life as this embodied person, how do I need to treat that with respect and awareness and openness. So I think that's one thing, is just the historical arc. I think also being mindful of oftentimes in families, adult children, and I can see this in myself some years ago when I was my grandmother's caregiver, adult children tend to use this phrase, I'm parenting my parent. I'm parenting my parent. That's not exactly it, right? And so I think language like that and thinking like that about this, for sure there's a role shift, for sure there's transitions, but that's sort of a either or binary way of thinking about care. I have to be her parent. I don't know, I will never accept that as a parent. I will accept care, and I will be very happy if my child can support me in care, but I will never say, yeah, you're my parent, right? Because that's a whole other ballgame. So I think just being aware of those things, and that plays into, for sure, like our trauma-informed principles of empowerment and choice and voice. When we carry these ideas that I'm now my mother's parent, that walks right into the arena of agency, of autonomy, of choice, of empowerment to make choice, and using your voice. So those would be sort of my off-the-cuff thoughts. What do you think about that? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It makes sense as far as like kind of how we see the way we connect and provide services to people, and even with regard to our interpersonal relationships. With regard to the issue of family violence, I'm thinking of my professional experience and working in that field, that I felt like there was a lot of ageism with regard to services and opportunity for support for
sure. And there's yeah, and I think there's one kind of aspect of ageism, maybe. So I'll be interested to see if this is the type of manifestation of ageism that you have seen in your career. And it goes back to that idea, if I'm parenting my parent, that's infant. I can't ever say this word. Infantilizing, treating someone as an infant. And I think you see that quite a bit in the service sector. Oh look, young lady. Can I help you, young lady? right? What is the point of this? Like,
I know.
or assuming that elders we interact with, assuming cognitive decline, assuming falsities that as we age and as we grow old that we can't learn. Also, just sort of threading back to COVID, it's shocking the amount of providers and aging services, aging disability services that believe elders can't use technology. I mean, that just rolls off the tongue like the ABCs. Well, older adults don't use computers. Like, people actually still say that. I don't know. That's not actually true.
That's not actually true
If
in
there's
any cases,
yeah.
but it's also true that not everybody uses a lot of technology in their life and their work, and that's true across the lifespan, particularly with folks that, again, I think with regard to your analysis of kind of historical context, that there are a number of people that were experienced the world in a very, very different way, and so
Sure.
this is kind of a new thing that they haven't necessarily embraced.
Right.
To the extent that but I would say that across generations,
Yep.
that historical to context, again, not to stereotype, but that there is a difference between how my brain was wired growing up versus my son's brain was wired growing up, with regard to a lot of different, and I actually think a lot of it is very strength based, because I think that younger generations often have a much more global context for the world, and have a very creative way of seeing things outside of how I was raised, or to my perception of the world. So it's interesting to hear these discussions. With regard, I did want to circle back around, is the intersectionality with regard to domestic and family violence. One of the issues that I think we really have an opportunity to lift up is the issue of economic support or lack thereof for elders, and that the biggest growing population experiencing homelessness are older adults.
Yep.
Because we don't have safety, particularly women, right? Because people are relying on Social Security for their income, and you only get that when you pay into it. And women oftentimes have spent much of their life providing non-paid labor. They don't have a lot of Social Security, and so they live in sometimes really, really harsh poverty. And those are issues that have a direct impact on family violence and people's abilities for autonomy and to make healthy choices and independent choices for themselves. So I think that's an issue too, that, kind of a macro level issue that's very much related. It's all based in ageism, I think. And maybe capitalism, but that's a whole nother topic.
Right. Yeah, that's really good. We've done a lot of work in Richmond around increasing homelessness among older adults, and I think another structural piece there is, at least in Richmond, right. Well, the story overall pre-COVID has been a pretty nice drop in homelessness. As you disaggregate that data by age, it's the opposite, as you said. It's actually fairly dramatically increased over the last 10 years or so. When we did some work with Homeward to really dig into that and look at it and see how are our systems not connected, and where is really this problem, where are we kind of just failing our community, the data indicated that there was very little support for the age group 50 to 59, and that in Richmond, anyway, in our region, that rise was particularly pronounced among African American men in that 50 to 59. And so I think a structural component there that is policy driven is most, the Older Americans Act, which was reauthorized in 2020, is the biggest policy statement on what it means to grow old in America. It's about billion of funding a year to area agencies on aging and other services around the whole country. And those services are limited, most of them, to 60 and older. And so there's very little the Aging Service Network can do in this earlier sort of demographic of 50 to 59. I think that's kind of not understanding age and ageism as well. I mean, I know you have to have some parameters, but chronological age is one measure of age, just one. And it doesn't necessarily mean anything in and of itself. 80,
So
yeah. Anyway, I was about to go on a tangent, but stop me.
well, no, so I think it's funny that we were before this started saying, oh, are we gonna have enough things to talk about? And we're like, we could talk for the rest of the afternoon. So I do have other things that I have lots of other things I'd like to discuss, but I don't want to forget the comments that we have and the questions that we have. So from Ginny Powell, she said that she's been having conversations with her peers about the value of senior living, apartments, condos, communities. Is there research about how these housing arrangements impact social cohesion and longevity?
Oh, that's a great question. There's so many different ways to configure senior living. I think there's mixed and inconclusive research, and that's probably not my space to comment on the whole body of work, except to say that there does seem to be value of living in groups of mixed ages. And I think coming back to the heterogeneity of aging, I'm just not informed enough to speak to what the research says conclusively around different types of housing situations directly related to longevity. But there is really interesting emerging evidence around intergenerational communities, and that seems to be kind of gaining some traction. But I do also see within the nursing home culture change movement, it appears like to me what seems to be being evaluated pretty positively is smaller communities where people can not be so driven by kind of activity schedules and big organizations trying to fit you into their day, but that's either smaller enclaves or smaller groups that really allow for people to live in the way they desire to live, which really might not be me eating lunch every day at 10:45 or taking a shower on Wednesdays. That
nobody wants to live like that, right? So Taylor made a really good comment. I think that you'll be able to kind of expound on, but they feel that ageism and ableism go hand in hand many times, especially as seen with COVID. That's a great observation, I think.
That's a great insight. It is absolutely true. Yep. Those are sort of the big last stands of discrimination that can't, if we can amplify those experiences and voices right now, I think it is to our benefit.
It seems like COVID, I keep saying this, but I just believe it so much, is that COVID is like a magnifying glass. It has been a magnifying glass over all of our broken parts.
Truly.
And like to the point where it's really, really hard to ignore some of this stuff.
And right. And if we can seize the moment and make something really wonderful happen. And so I'll just sort of make one little quick comment by way of saying this is possible. This type of change we're talking about as a result of what we've all been through, it's possible. There's a community, a long-term care community in Northern Virginia called Goodwin House. And a couple of weeks ago, I had the chance to really listen in on some of the really transformative work they're doing around living wage, which started before COVID, when they decided to undertake a serious look at what it means to pay a living wage. How might this community do that? And they put their money where their mouth is. They talk to their residents. They sort of explain the situation of inequity and what the pressure of not making a living wage does to the workforce. The residents really bought into it. They worked their budget and their finances, and today CNAs at Goodwin House start at $19 an hour, and then by the spring they will all be starting at $21 an hour. I'm oversimplifying it. It wasn't an easy process. There was a lot of complexity, a lot of conversations, but this is a model for us that people that I think that speaks to this economic space of family violence, right? That we really have to get serious about. Like Rob Reich said, we're not in a labor shortage, we're in a living wage shortage.
Yeah. And another really great comment, and very much in line with facts work, but the issue of kind of parenting your parent, that lack of autonomy and really kind of, not to overuse the word, but really kind of respect for individuality and humanity with regard to that terminology and that view also is related to how we see children, right? And that just in our society, when you say parenting, so often there's this idea of control and governance over an individual being that is just because they're your child. And that this is just kind of that kind of framework expanded to a larger level, but it's the same sort of issue that, we're not here to govern one another necessarily, but to care for one another, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
That's a wonderful observation, Taylor. Did I say that right? I know I just added my extrapolations into it, but
that's profound. And I think ageism and ableism also, we could kind of go down that little road there too, right? Because this, so another ism, paternalism, right, gets in our way. We really walk around as providers or adult children or parents, at least with elders, thinking that we know best. We know the right thing for you. And our values might be contrasting or at odds. And I think we also, as hard as it is to accept, grown people have the right to make bad decisions. And that might only be a bad decision by my perspective. You know what I mean? I mean, it's this could be a really fun conversation. But
yeah, it could be, because I can also see some nuances having, being a parent, that when you have a little person, part of your job is to teach them how to function in the world, and so you have to insert on some level of autonomy that they have, right? Because otherwise it's not a good thing for society. But that overarching idea of kind of molding people and having that paternalistic control over them is really toxic to anybody in any phase of life. So I think that's the overall.
Right. And I think maybe what you're also getting at is this idea that autonomy is relational. We can kind of get back into this corner of believing that autonomy is absolute, but is it? That would be a really.
We get into trouble with that, right? We see that happening now in a public health space.
Before the trouble, yeah.
Exactly. Boy, this has been such a great talk, and this hour has flown by for me. And I feel like we could have 20 more hours on so many different topics that came up during this time. But we're at the end of our hour. Can you believe it?
So much fun.
So I just want to thank you so much again, Gigi, and really be prepared for us to see if we can get you to come back. And maybe, we didn't even touch on our partnership on that project that you all took the lead on with VCU and the nursing home project. And that's a really exciting project, but maybe we can have you back in the next month or so to really kind of give us an update and an overview of that, because that's pretty exciting work.
Oh yeah, I would love that. And that was really great. And now we're in part 2 of that work. We're expanding and extending that based on what we learned from the first project. So that would be fun. And we're
that would be great, because there's a lot of I'm dying to talk. I often reference the focus group results that you all got with regard to the language that's used in this work and how you kind of pivoted based on that. And really just exciting things that kind of touch on a lot of different angles on the issue of trauma and resiliency and family violence. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I guess we're going to call it the end of our lunch and learn. But we appreciate it, and we look forward to our next one.
That's wonderful.
Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you, Nicole. Thanks so much, Taylor. See y'all later. Bye.